All right, so we'll start on our last session today, Contemporary Europe. Mudde, University of Georgia, Alina, Polyakova, Atlantic Council, and our host, our Daniel Kelemen. So go ahead, you go first, Cass. And so we 15 minutes. What did you say? 15 or 20 minutes each?
Yeah, let's do 15 each, and we got to stick to time because they're going to turn off the videotaping at 5. So, and we want some time for Q&A and everything. Yeah.
This is even lower now. Okay. I hope you can hear me. Generally loud enough. So, what I'm going to do is pretty much give a very short overview of some of my thoughts about populism, which takes it back a bit from the regime level. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind that is, first of all, populist parties have been around in Europe for quite a while, several decades now, and the vast majority of them are not in power. Doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have an effect. So just to make it clear how I think about populism, I think about populism as a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, general will of the people. And so important is that I think it's an ideology, not just a discourse, which means that it will actually influence policies, and that the distinction is moral. And that is very important. This is not a clash of interest, it's a clash of values, and actually it even goes further than that. It's pretty much good against evil. So populism is, in essence, pro-democratic in the sense that democracy is popular sovereignty and majority rule, but it's anti-liberal democratic, where think about rule of law, separation of powers, those kind of things. And so it's a different threat from the threat of fascism of the 30s. It's more subtle to a certain extent. It can be left or right. We have seen that depends on what I call the host ideology of populist actors. Simply stated, on the left, populist actors tend to combine populism with some form of socialism. On the right, they tend to combine it with some form of nationalism or nativism even. And today it's more left-wing in the south, more right-wing in the north. On average, applies to both Europe and North America. This is a very basic overview of the score of populist parties in national elections, European elections, overall the rank in national elections, the percentage of total means the percentage of total scores of all populist parties in a country, and then the percentage of change. Can I close the door?
Yeah.
It's a bit confusing. Is the percentage of change of all populist parties in the national elections compared to the previous national elections. And so to summarize, populist parties are more or less successful in most European countries, which means literally more than the majority. But more or less successful means, on average, about 15%. Now, of course, most countries are multi-party systems, and one of the things that most analysis of contemporary European politics are missing, I think, is the fact that big parties have almost disappeared. And so in almost all, even the established West European party systems, a big party is a party of 30%. Right? Parties of 40% are outside of, like, Orban to a certain extent, and some others just don't exist anymore. And so in the Netherlands, we actually have only one party above 20%. So if you have 10% or 12%, you can easily be the third biggest party in your country. Now, that makes you a relevant actor, but it also means that in most countries, like up to 85% of the people don't vote for a populist party. And so pretty important, I think. Overall, the trend is up, but most populist parties are volatile. Even the ones that have been around for decades go up and down. And there are massive cross-national and cross-temporal differences within Europe. And so the discourse that we have about this kind of overarching struggle between an emboldened populism and an embattled status quo is very simplistic. It's based on only a couple of countries. We should have a much more, I think, we should complicate it a bit more. Causes why is populism successful now? It's actually remarkable that on populism per se, so not so much radical right, on populism per se, there's very little theoretical literature. Much of the explanations of the success of individual populist actors are actually much more linked to the host ideology, like nativism, than they are necessarily to the populism. And so many of these explanations are still very vague. So the first one is that important issues are not adequately addressed by elites. But what is important here is not so much the objective part, but the subjective part. People feel that important issues are not adequately addressed by elites. Now they're related, for sure, but not so close. Issues like immigration and European integration were indeed not addressed in the 80s and most of the 90s in various countries. They are today, and yet in the Netherlands, a country which has undoubtedly the most Islamophobic political culture in Europe, there is a sizable portion of the Dutch population who thinks that you can't say anything about Islam. And yet, we say everything about Islam except relatively positive things. Right? But we all know from electoral research that doesn't matter. Right? They're acting on the basis of what they think happens. Elites are perceived as being all the same. Again, this is related in part to reality. I mean, the difference in policies between a center-left and a center-right government these days are extremely small. And when they're within the EU, they're even smaller. The EU sets very large limits on what you can and cannot do. And as a consequence, if you're not really busy with the nuts and bolts of politics, most parties do look pretty much the same. I think one of the things that is a bit missed is that people have more efficacy. What Ronald Egelhart described as cognitive mobilization, which means that people are better educated, but they also have more self-confidence politically. And so when we talk about this golden age of democracy, as I said earlier, if we would bring those politicians back that we now all think were so wonderful, right? They actually would also be roasted. But at that point in time, most of the people were not critical towards their leaders. They just voted for their party, and they followed their leaders. Populist actors are more attractive. They're just better these days. Marine Le Pen is a very competent politician. Geert Wilders is a very competent politician. And the media structure is more favorable. Most newspapers are no longer owned or linked to political parties or social movements like trade unions. Gatekeeper function has been undermined. Social media plays a role in that. So relationship to democracy, let me also plug my book, which is Populism, a very short introduction. And this is completely irrelevant to my presentation, but given that a lot of other people actually work on democratization, I think one of the things that is really missing in the literature on populism is the relationship to the process of democratization as well as de-democratization. But I only focus on liberal democracies. So these are the effects on that. One of the things that you see is that one effect of populism, successful populism and liberal democracies, is the politicization or repoliticization of certain issues. Certain issues are being brought back or are being brought onto the political agenda. There would not have been a similar debate about immigration, at least not at that point in time, without radical right parties. European Union, pretty much similar kind of things. There is a polarization of the political debate. We have talked a lot about it. I personally don't think that the Liberal Democrats are innocent in that. In most of the countries that I know, actually the way that populists have been approached before they became successful was pretty much as hateful as what populists do. What's most important, though, is what you see when populists become very successful, the opposition to populists becomes also moral. And so it becomes an anti-populism. And I think the best example and the most dramatic example was the Hillary Clinton campaign towards Trump. Hillary Clinton campaign was actually more negative than Trump and was less about issues. Right? She was completely went into the anti-Trump, the anti-populism, which was a purely normative campaign. The problem when you talk about norms is that you can't compromise very easy, particularly when you're populist. When you're populist, you're pure, they corrupt. If you make a compromise, the pure gets corrupted. Right? And so that's a part why this polarization is so strong. There's an increasing use of plebiscitarian instruments, mostly referendums. They're almost always opportunistic. I think actually Chavez is one of the few who has accepted defeat by referendum. The weirdest was, of course, Alexis Tsipras, who won a referendum and then ignored it. But recently Orban lost one and then by and large ignored that and tried to do it in parliament. We see a weakening of non-majoritarian institutions, courts and media. We have talked a lot about it. And then I think, as Hungary shows, ultimately a slow transformation into an illiberal democracy. And I think one of the most challenging parts of the Hungary thing is that for a long time we have a lot in terms of democratization is about the context. And so there is no better context for liberal democracy, one would argue, than the European Union. And so the fact that within the European Union a relatively consolidated liberal democracy can become illiberal is, I think, one of the most amazing and depressing parts of that story. Thank you.
So thank you for setting the stage. I was hoping you would do that with your presentation, because I have to apologize in advance. I have to leave at 4:30, so I hope that we'll get some conversation going before that. What I thought I would do, and I don't have slides. Apparently I'm out of touch with academic environments these days. But I just wanted to lay out some ideas for you to consider and to also talk about a paper that is under review by myself and a co-author in Switzerland that I think might be interesting to consider in the Q&A. So there's 5 points I want to make in the 10 to 15 minutes that I'm going to take. One is to talk just very briefly. I think you already gave a nice overview of the rise of the populist right and left in Europe, but talk a little bit about those contextual differences between countries and over time that you mentioned very briefly. And I don't know if we already covered sort of basic things about what the electorate of the far right looks like in a previous session or not, but just to quickly mention what is driving this populist moment in Europe today. I think it's important to remember and also think about some of these theories and findings that mainly based, I think, in older studies still relevant today with the expansion of the electorate that votes for the far right. And then I'll put some ideas on the table on what I think is happening now that is relatively new, that we don't have a lot of studies on yet that I've seen anyways. And I'll talk a little bit about the response of the center-right to the rise of the far right and what that is leading to, what the effect is in liberal democracy specifically, and this is the study I mentioned. And last but not least, I'll mention Russia very briefly. So I think it is important to remember, as you were saying as well in your presentation, that one, even though this may seem like a emergence out of the blue, out of a vacuum of a populist moment in liberal democracies, in Europe it certainly is not. Many of these parties, particularly Western European parties like the National Front and the Austrian Freedom Party, have been around for many, many decades. And what's interesting to me is if we looked at some of the academic literature in the 1990s, when the Central Eastern European former socialist countries freed themselves from the Iron Curtain, and at the time there was a lot of thinking about the re-emergence of sort of tribal nativism and nationalism in that particular region without the overarching control of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And this idea that the Central Eastern European countries are the backwards countries in terms of development, both economic, political, and cultural, is actually a completely false narrative. And if we look at the electoral support for particularly far-right political parties in Western Eastern Europe today, there's still a profound gap on average between how well these parties do in Western European countries and then how well they do in Central Eastern European countries. And I think I've done some graphing of this, maybe I should have brought a PowerPoint, but it's a pretty stark and consistent difference. The trend lines are going up. Together, there's a gap between Western and Eastern Europe. And the drivers of support, I think, between West and East, so the former, could say, socialist space, are quite different. So we're talking about the economy earlier. I mean, I completely agree that, the economic situation and also other usual suspects like immigration inflows or the percent of foreign born in a country, however you want to measure the proportion of non-natives in a specific national environment, don't seem to matter for electoral outcomes. But I still think that the declining economic conditions, at least the perceived decline of economic condition, the perceived increase of immigration, do matter. I mean, they're necessary, but certainly not sufficient conditions for the rise of nativist far-right parties. And if we look at who votes for these parties, during the primaries in the United States, particularly the Republican primaries, if we looked at the electorate that voted for Donald Trump in the Republican primaries, it looked very, very similar to the electorate, demographically speaking, of the far-right populists in Europe. I don't know if there's many academic work comparing these two, but certainly the lower level of SES, socioeconomic status, occupational background being more working class or lower middle class, predominantly white. I mean, Europe, that's, I guess, a bit more expected, and men being overrepresented in that electorate as well. So I think if many of us in the States were looking at Europe in the 1990s, when we saw in greater and greater numbers the working class specifically leaving the constituency of the center left and the traditional labor parties and moving closer to the far right, there would have been some lessons we could have learned for the United States and what many of us saw as an unexpected electoral outcome in our own presidential elections. So I think some of those ongoing trends of the working class specifically, these kind of electorates that should be voting for labor parties, for center-left parties, for the Democratic Party in the United States, moving further to the right, something that we're now seeing come to the fore here in the United States and across many European countries. So that's kind of all old, I suppose. But I think what's new and interesting is looking at the changing electorate of these, particularly on the far right. That's what I tend to focus on. So maybe the situation on the far left is quite different. Traditionally, younger people are underrepresented in the electorate of the far right, but I think that's starting to change. Specifically, just some opinion polls, not models, suggest that 25 to 30% of French youth, I think it's up to the age of 30, support the National Front. So that's a pretty significant number. I don't know what the numbers are for all European countries, but I think this is starting to be, this is the beginning of a broader trend that we're going to see how it develops. And I think in a common sense perspective, it makes a lot of sense. If we look at where Europe it has been since the economic crisis in 2008, 2009, in the southern flank, you have unemployment rates up to 50%. They've been declining now for the youth, 30 to 40%, places like Italy, Portugal, and Spain. Worse still in Greece. So if you imagine yourself as a young person who maybe finished university around 2008, you've potentially been unemployed for almost 10 years. So of course, what will we expect from this next generation? Why would they support the quote-unquote mainstream centrist parties where they haven't seen much benefit from those parties in their own lives? But I think this is something that we need to study more to understand what's really happening with this new generation. I think the other new thing that there's more and more research on now is the response strategies of the center-right parties and also center-left parties. And the study that I was mentioning that is currently under review in European political science looks at this question studying the year 2000. So how have the center-right parties responded to the challenge from the far right across all European countries in national parliamentary elections? And we were particularly interested on party positions towards the EU, because Euroscepticism, I think, has become the overarching meta-narrative for the far right in Western and Eastern Europe in an increasing way. That wasn't always the case. At some point, actually, far-right parties were pro-Europe because they were far-right in the economic sense. They were pro-open markets and economic liberalization, which the EU, of course, ushered in. But that situation has changed, and most of these parties are now peddling a sort of economic protectionism. And so looking at this anti-EU or Eurosceptic party position, we tracked party positions for the center-right and the far-right over this time period since the year 2000, and then looking at electoral outcomes in national parliamentary elections. And interestingly enough, some of the initial findings from the study basically tell us that when the center-right adopts this anti-EU agenda, so they move closer to the far right on the specific issue, over time, it is the far right that benefits from this convergence. And I think the reasons for that, the way that we thought about it, why we saw this happening in this particular study is twofold. One, when you have the center moving closer to the far right, of course it legitimizes and gives credence to the agenda of the far right, and it mainstreams that agenda. It sets the policy discourse on whether that be anti-EU politics, and I would be interested to see if that would be true for other political positions, such as immigration policy, for example. And then the second piece of that is why it seems to benefit the far right is because nobody wants to copy when they can have the original. You know, why vote for the center right when you have, Le Pen, who's been running on this agenda for a decade? She seems to be the more legitimate. People like her and parties like the National Front seem to be legitimate bearers of these ideas. And then when other parties pick up those ideas, they're just seen as mimicking them or legitimizing them, but not necessarily being authentic. So this question of authenticity, I think, is important here. But again, this is just speculation based on those findings that I think we need to think about a little bit more. I think the other piece we need to think about when we're talking about the rise of populist politics on the left and on the right is what that says about the center, and what I see as a complete collapse of the center-left that is unfolding across Europe. The Dutch elections recently, I think, in the media anyways, they were covered as this moment of truth where the populists didn't get what they wanted, right? Wilders didn't get first place, as he was projected to at some point before. The center-right won. Well, if we look at what actually happened, the center-right had to basically adopt some of the agenda of the far right, and it worked in that one-off election. It'll fail in the long term if the findings of the study are correct. And the second piece is that the Labour Party came in at something like 6%. And we're seeing this happening in France as we speak, where now we have two anti-establishment candidates, more or less as the two front runners, the National Front, of course, and then an independent candidate who's more or less running as a center leftist, Emmanuel Macron. And the Labour Party, the Socialist Party in France, their candidate is polling at 9%. And this is a mainstream, center-left party, the party of the current president of France. So what does that tell us? I think it tells us that the rise of the far right is in many ways a symptom of a broader political problem. And that problem is that the mainstream has completely failed to provide compelling narratives to the new problems that people face as a result of economic stagnation, security anxieties, etc. Lastly, very briefly, Russia came into my life as a study of this by accident, in a way, because I've always been interested more in the domestic drivers of these kinds of parties and political movements. But then what I started noticing a few years ago is this building network relationship between the United Russia Party, the Kremlin, President Putin, and leaders of certain far-right parties, and some relationship formation between the parties and the United Russia Party as well, in the form of signing of cooperation association agreements. So I think in our media, this often gets interpreted as these political actors, these political parties, National Front, Jobbik, even Orban, and the Freedom Party, the AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, that they are sort of puppets of the Kremlin, useful idiots, if you will. But I actually think that's a pretty naive way of looking at it, but there's no question in my mind that the emergence of a pro-Russian agenda among many of these parties is quite counterintuitive if you think about it. Why, if you're a nationalist political party, why support the, say, revisionist intentions of another foreign government? It doesn't make that much sense. But nonetheless, that's been an interesting new twist in this story, that these parties are not just about domestic issues. Many of them have taken on an anti-establishment foreign policy agenda, which takes the form of being pro-Kremlin and pro-Putin. And so I think we don't really understand the extent to which what the populists themselves are getting out of this relationship. I think it's pretty clear what the Kremlin is getting out of this relationship. I can talk about that a little bit more later. But it's not clear what the far right is getting out of it to me, because it's not clear that they're always getting money. Although that's certainly the case for some, like the National Front. So those are just some ideas I wanted to put out there for a discussion, and I think I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we're good on time.
Yeah.
Show me a 5-minute warning. Here. Slideshow. All right. Thanks very much. This
seat for you in the middle?
Oh yes. Yeah. No, I think I need more than the glass of water they have there for that group.
It's not water.
No. Okay. Well, this talk I'm going to give today, actually, in a sense, this is based on a paper that has just come out in Government and Opposition. It's my pinned tweet, if you want to find it, and it's for free in Government Opposition. I have free access right now, so you can get it. So I'm going to talk about the findings and the argument of this paper, but I should just say, by way of background, in a way, this paper sort of brings together my whole 20-year career so far. In a way, things come full circle, because I started out as an academic. I was going to study democratization in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, right? But then I got sidetracked by an interest in EU and EU law and European integration, and I thought I had left Hungary totally behind because it was boring, it was consolidated democracy, and I could just move on studying the EU. But then, all of a sudden, things have developed in a way that brought my interests together, and that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the EU in this talk more than some of the other talks touched on the role of the EU, but I'm going to go deeper into the role of the EU, and I'm going to look at the way a national authoritarian regime can survive in what's supposed to be a union of democracies. So, first, for context, let's think, how did we get where we are in Hungary? How did this happen that a democratic member state, supposedly, of a union that demands democracy, rule of law, et cetera, as conditions of membership, could be in a situation where they're locking up refugees in containers at the border, beating them, et cetera, where they've just passed a law that would have the effect of shutting down the last free university in the country. And for more details, read Kasa's great op-ed in The Guardian last week. That about 2 days after signing the Rome Declaration on the 60th birthday of the EU, Orban comes home and starts a referendum there. That's a thing, the Stop Brussels referendum, where he's doing a push poll to every household in Hungary saying, what are the ways in which the EU has overstepped the most and where we really need to stop them, right? Because he wants to turn public opinion against the EU. And by the way, I mean, there's some ironies with, and then there's been this, of course, huge public backlash, and this picture's from yesterday, right? We have massive protests. We don't know exact numbers, but upwards of 50,000 over the weekend in Budapest, protesting for the CEU and for civil society. Here's and look, they hoist the EU flag, okay? Because they believe that the EU stands for democracy, and they want to be part of the EU and defend us against the autocrat Orban. And that's the protesters against the riot police in front of the CEU. And by the way, the Stop Brussels campaign, there's lots of nice ironies in this. They plastered ads all over the Budapest subway, right, which was paid for by the EU, okay, right? So, here's more of the signs all over the subway paid for by the EU. Here is a Stop Brussels sign next to a hospital where it says this hospital was paid for, the construction of this hospital by EU Regional Development Fund. So what the heck is going on, right? Anyway, I don't have time to go through all my, this one says Stop Brussels, and then the graffiti artist says, but send the money, yeah? Right? Okay. Now, let me get to that. We're going to unfold that story. So first, I want to say, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but for people who study the EU, when they think about failures of democracy, they always think at the EU level. There's this whole big literature of self-flagellation by EU scholars who say, well, the EU is insufficiently democratic, people don't turn out for the elections, it's distant from the people, we have to make the EU more democratic. And there's valid points in there, okay? But it's always about, the distance for democracy in EU institutions, the Commission, Council, Court of Justice. Skip over all that story. But there's this big literature. Well, what I'm trying to do with this paper and my research is to say we got to flip this all on its head. The real puzzle with the EU is why there can be such a democratic deficit at the national level, not at the EU level. That's where the real deficit is. Okay, so why has the EU failed to intervene its core values, which every member state signed that they would uphold, and there's even a provision in the treaties where your voting rights can be suspended and other penalties can be imposed on you if you don't maintain democracy and the rule of law. Why hasn't anything been done? And why did this first happen in Hungary, and then why did Kaczynski say, I'm going to do the same thing in Poland? He said, I'm going to bring Budapest to Warsaw, and he's been doing it over the past year. Okay? And I approach this, most people who study the EU come from a more IR angle, but I'm kind of more trained as a comparativist, and I think about things comparatively. So I say, well, to answer this question, I think of the EU as a federation or quasi-federation. And from this perspective, and this is where it fits nicely with the themes of the conference, because when I sort of vaguely remembered when I was thinking about this, isn't there some literature by Latin Americanists about subnational authoritarianism? Like, I think I read some article in grad school, right? And so I started reading this stuff again, and I say, oh, well, actually, it turns out that authoritarianism at the state level within democratic federations is very common. In fact, here's some nice quotes from Ed Gibson from Northwestern. Subnational authoritarianism is a fact of life in most democracies. My old classmate from grad school, Carlos Gervasoni, who's an Argentine, where they had this phenomenon, same thing. It's very common that while you democratize at the national level, you have it subnational authoritarianism. I could put a Rob Mickey quote up there as well. It's a shame he was sick and couldn't make it, but he's written about that phenomenon in the U.S. as well. So it's no surprise, okay? And the main reason, so why does this happen? The main reason, the big punchline of my article is it's driven mostly by party politics, right? And Koss, I think, alluded to this, and others talking about reactions of the center-right. We're kind of getting at this. But essentially, if the local authoritarian delivers seats in the national legislature or votes in national level elections to a national party or coalition of which that party is a member, then they will tolerate and protect their authoritarian. That's what the story of the Democrats vis-a-vis Southern Democrats in the period Solid South. It's the story with many authoritarian caudillo rulers, in whether it's in Argentina or similar things in Mexico. So this is just sadly typical question of putting party over principle. Okay, and here I've been writing about this stuff for years, and lots of people now finally shouting about this. I felt like this thing I placed 2 years ago in Politico, but I had other places that wouldn't publish this stuff in op-eds. They say you're being too extreme. Orban's not so bad, but I was right. And this is EPP loves Orban. What am I talking about? There's the European People's Party, okay, which is the center-right bloc in the European Parliament of the center-right parties that brings together Merkel's Christian Democrats, other center-right parties, and Fidesz, Orban's party, is a member. They deliver 12 seats in the European Parliament. That's and then if you counted a couple Romanians who are allied with them, maybe up to 15, and that's the majority of the EPP's majority of seats. And they would get down to a razor-thin minority without it. He's a loyal member. He delivers his MEPs, members of the European Parliament, vote party line in the European Parliament all the time. And the EPP has the majority, and that, based on that, gets control of a lot of the agenda. So they protect him. And they do this all the time. Okay? And just to kind of fast forward, this literature also tells us something about when authoritarian enclaves might fall, which I'll come back to in the end of my talk. And again, the story is one of party politics, where what this literature says is that if the National Party allied with the local opposition can intervene and feed resources to them, maybe they could break the grip of the local authoritarian, okay? And if the National Party allied with the local authoritarian starts to find them too embarrassing, if they start doing things that tarnish the brand, maybe they would intervene to try to stop. Don't count on the courts for reasons I could say. It's really got to be partisan to stop them. Okay? And so my basic analysis, and this really goes back to some of the talk in the first panel, maybe Lucan's talk and others, about whether there's an equilibrium that can persist. I think the EU is right now trapped in an authoritarian equilibrium, I call it, where it has enough party politics. It's democratized enough that the European Parliament is powerful and important enough that and also having a majority is important enough that there are reasons to protect your local authoritarian. But it doesn't have enough democratic politics, let's say, to legitimize outright interventions to try to oust Orban, or let's say, and in fact some of the things are illegal. You might say, why don't European socialist parties help the beleaguered, disorganized, fractionalized socialists in Hungary? It's illegal under the statute on European political parties for them to give any money, right, to their members at the national level, right? So it's not even legal, and it would be perceived probably as illegitimate. So the EPP guys can say nice things about Orban, give him the pat on the back and the protection from sanctions by blocking sanctions, but then the other side can't go in with money and resources to help the opposition, pathetic as it is. And on top of that, since he controls the government and he gets all the EU money, he can use that to prop up his regime, Subway, right, I showed you. And on top of that, another sort of side factor besides the party politics is, of course, being in this union, it's nice, people aren't locked behind an iron curtain, but that means the people who don't like it, they can leave, right, and they do. And the 500,000 young, educated Hungarians who don't live there anymore, a lot of them would have voted against it. Okay, so, what happened? How much time do I have left now?
5.
Okay, so this story has been told in a way in different talks, so I'm just going to fast forward. We can come back and Q&A. I'm not going to tell you the whole story of Hungary. But essentially, Orban got elected in free and fair election. Oh, sorry, skip that one. In 2010, and because the other side sort of had imploded, he got a 2/3 majority in Parliament. Their system had very few checks and balances if you had 2/3, because if you had 2/3 of the seats, you could rewrite the Constitution, which he did. His actual friend, actually, it was his friend from law school, wrote it on his iPad, as he said. And anyway, they rewrote the Constitution to consolidate power. I'm just going to fast forward. All the usual suspects that Erica and others have talked about these moves, these steps. They took over the Constitutional Court. They eliminated any independent offices that could have been checks on them. They took over the rest of the judiciary beyond the Constitutional Court. They attacked the media. As we've heard from others, they did things like have cronies take over some of the private media. They took over the public media. They used lawsuit threats, libel, all the rest. So they took over the media, closed down opposition newspapers. They attack civil society organizations, the latest of which is CEU. Then they changed the electoral law and advertising rules such that the OSCE said that the 2014 election was free but unfair. So it's this tilted playing field. Then they won re-election, and as soon as he won re-election, then the chains were off, and he openly declared, I'm going to build an illiberal state on the model of Russia, Turkey, and China. And even as he does this, right, in that campaign, as he does that, guess who's there to protect him and defend him? European People's Party leaders, okay? Even as others at the EU level are criticizing him, they're all socialists, right, or liberals, or Greens, right? The EPP, and by the way, Jan Werner Müller, full credit, has said, because in German it's the Europäische Volkspartei, EVP, right? But he says we should call it the European von Papen Party, right? Anyway, and I think that's quite fitting. Okay, I'm skipping over some of the Hungarian story. But again, I would just say there's a whole discussion among lawyers. I'm a law professor too, and lawyers say, oh, the problem was the EU lacked the right legal tools, and right now they're again saying, oh, do we need a new toolkit to prosecute this? And they're having all these discussions in Brussels this week. It's not about the legal tools. They had legal tools. They could have used more. But in the end, you're not going to stop an autocrat, you know, with an enforcement action or this kind of thing. You need political leadership from the center-right to denounce these guys, to withhold their money and things like that. And you haven't had it. Now, just in my last minute, fast forward, I'm just going to tell the mini version. What's different in Poland? So in Poland, Kaczynski, again, won a free and fair election. Similar story. The left had imploded. He comes to power. And just the quick version is, and he says, I'm going to bring Budapest to Warsaw. I'm going to use, Orban has shown us what we can do. We can have an illiberal regime in the EU. And he goes right after the Constitutional Court in the media as his first step. We're still in the midst of a constitutional crisis where the government won't publish rulings of the Constitutional Court. They can't agree on who the judges are because they tried to pack it. But what I want to say is the EU, although it's still unclear what they're going to do in the end, it's still sort of pending, but the EU took steps, such as launching this thing called the rule of law mechanism, right, against Poland, which they still, even as of today, when Timmermans, the Vice President of the Commission, announced, they're still not launching it against Hungary, even after everything, right? So they took more aggressive steps so far against Poland than Hungary. Why? The PIS, Kaczynski's party, is not in the European People's Party. It's in the further right ECR group, which is very small. His only significant ally is the Tories, right? And they're on their way out the door, obviously. But just to bolster my theory, what's the one big party other than Orban, who broke ranks to defend Kaczynski, his autocrat friend? The only other big party that defends Kaczynski in all the European Parliament votes is the Tories. Okay? They stick together. So if I have 30 seconds, I'll just stop. You know, there's lots more the EU could do. They could bring more legal actions. They could suspend voting rights. They could take away EU funding eventually. You know, my normative prescription would be they should do all these things. My positive analysis, sadly, is don't hold your breath, right? Because people consistently place principle over, party over principle, until and unless he's like rounding up people and killing them and stuff. It becomes too embarrassing. And that's part of what the EU do. You could say, is this a total indictment of the EU? Well, in a way it is. You could say, but, if it wasn't for the EU, maybe he'd be a full Putin. Now he's just a kind of like semi-restrained Putin, right, for now, right? So that, you're not quite Lukashenko, you're a little more toned down because you're an EU member. And, so I think that it's basically a depressing finding, but we were talking before, my dad's a Hungarian Holocaust survivor who, has a different perspective, makes me think about this historically. And I guess you could say, well, on the other hand, you could say Hungary's made great progress because now all they do is lock up refugees in containers and beat them and violate law, but they don't round up people and kill them. All right, thank you.
Thank you. So what time do we have until? Just
what time is it right now?
It is 4:15.
15?
4:15.
We have
Until,
a
what
half
time
hour.
We're going to end at 4:30 or 4:45.
Well, 4:45.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
4:45. And
Okay.
but Alina has to leave a little early, so we should direct some questions.
Okay. So.
Oh, right.
Okay. Let me move up. Let me move over. Okay. So I'll just so as discussant, I'll just have a couple of comments before we open it up, if I might. So I think I enjoyed all these presentations. I mean, and it's sort of building a bit. It's the last session of the day, so building a bit maybe on what other people have said so far today. It seems like there's 4 questions occurred to me, or 4 issues that sort of cut across that each of you will maybe find relevant. So First, I mean, coming off of Kos's presentation about what is populism, I mean, I remember actually taking a course in graduate school. It was the worst course I ever took in graduate school at Berkeley, which was a great graduate training. Although it was a course on populism, and we just spent the semester running in circles, and it just didn't go anywhere. And I'm teaching a course now on populism, and I hope my students don't say the same thing. So Kos, I know your definition, and I know how you think about this, and I find it very convincing. But there's a couple of things, the new developments sort of have made me think about. So we make this distinction between left populism and right populism, and the difference between a populist and a Democrat is a populist is a kind of illiberal Democrat, and Democrats are liberal Democrats. And I guess I'm kind of reminded here of, so that's a set of distinctions. I'm reminded here, I mean, I must imagine you must have some views on Jan Werner Muller's book, What is Populism? And one of the interesting points that comes out of that book is he makes this case, which I thought very provocative and interesting, which is why give populists the credit of being illiberal Democrats? They're just authoritarians. Democracy, by definition, is liberal democracy. And so by making this distinction, it lets authoritarians off the hook to claim the mantle of democracy and to say that, oh, we're illiberal Democrats, as Orban does. So what if they're just authoritarians? And so I guess I wonder if maybe we ought not think of a distinction between authoritarian populists and democratic populists. Because the stuff that Dan is describing in Hungary, I mean, this is authoritarianism. I mean, so why call this populism? And maybe, but it's not, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, maybe there's some West European populists that aren't as authoritarian, So I'm not sure, but I guess this gets quite messy. But I guess the point is, what do you think of this distinction? What if we say that democracy, by definition, you said rule of law is about the liberal part of democracy, which is a quite standard way of thinking about these things. But if you really think about what is the rule of law, the reason we care about the rule of law is the rule of law is there to protect civil liberties, which Lucan told us earlier today is at the heart of the definition of democracy. So the moment somebody's an illiberal Democrat, they're just simply not a Democrat. I mean, that's in some ways an oxymoron, I guess. So that's one. So I'm wondering if we should jettison this distinction between liberal and illiberal democracy. That's the first kind of general question. Second question, in terms of who the supporters are. And this comes back to Diana's presentation earlier today. I mean, this comes out of your comments, Alina. So in Diana's, so I kind of want to put the two of you into conversation, I guess. So in the presentation we heard from Diana earlier, if I remember, the cross section was Hillary supporters versus Trump supporters, sort of at the end of the day, at the time of the general election. And and Alina was talking about differences within Republican voters, and so it seems to me that if you want to know who populists are, it's a moving target depending on when you ask the question in the primary process. So by the time November 2016, when all 90% of Republicans were on board, you kind of wonder, is that shaping the findings about who are the populists? And that we have wealthy Republicans, traditional Republicans, everybody on board. Whereas had you asked early in the primary process, the kind of core of the Trump phenomena, who his supporters were at this earlier point versus, let's say, Bush or Rubio supporters, would have you gotten a different profile that looks more like, so this is a function and part of the two-party system versus a multi-party system. If this were a multi-party system, the core of the Trump phenomena, does this actually look more like the West European populism in a multi-party system? So I wonder if, Diane, if you have any information on that, so we could sort of think about that. Yes, yeah.
There are so many different
Right.
versions of what would qualify
Right.
as that. And it's not really a long Republican middle that politics.
Yeah.
Democrats who would vote Trump, who don't normally.
Yeah.
And there are Republicans who have lost who would do choices and sex. So
Yeah. So I guess the question would be, if do we have information? I know there was some early polling data. I mean, we obviously don't have election data from early on, but we have kind of polling data for who was leaning towards Trump and what their profile was like. And I kind of remember hearing lots of disagreements about, is this really the white working class or not? Or are these upper income? By the end, the Trump supporters are wealthier than Hillary supporters. But I think in some ways that's not giving this phenomena a fair shot. So we can come back to that discussion. A third point, so what to do about populists at the national level. And so it occurs to me as you were just talking that it seems like there's four strategies. I sort of think of four generic strategies. One is the kind of cordon sanitaire that David Ardes talked about in his own work, where you just, exclude, distance yourself, the center-right distance itself, and that's kind of, I've tended to lean towards that stance as well. A second strategy is to take their issues and to co-opt them, and this runs the risk, as you say, you sort of become your enemy. A third strategy, though, is in some way kind of more, civil protest or, citizen engagement to condemn this as unacceptable form of politics, which I guess Koss would say is not a good thing to do. And then a fourth one, which is maybe the naive, the kind of, but there's, I wonder if this is a viable strategy, is just the kind of liberal solution is win the argument, come up with a better pitch, compete electorally and come up with a better pitch. I mean, is that hopelessly naive? But at some level, why is that so naive? I mean, there should be something better on offer. So I kind of wonder if that's actually something we should think more about. And so I guess maybe, this Koss also talked about the kind of normative campaign of the Clinton campaign against Trump, and I kind of don't know where that fits. Maybe that kind of fits in the civil protest. Just complete, or the cordon sanitaire, but these are political rivals at this point. So how does that fit into this kind of dealing with this phenomenon from this position of the center right? And then finally, what to do. The fourth point I wanted to make, as the last point, is what to do about it at the level of the EU. And I think this is where Dan's work is so fascinating, to think about this as an international phenomena and within an international context, especially within Europe, obviously. And there's these real parallels between the EPP dealing with this party that it kind of, in some sense, has this relationship with. There's an analog at the national level to the international level, and that's very interesting. And actually, I just got an email, I realized at the beginning of the week I didn't respond to, from somebody from the EPP asking to meet with me to talk about what they should do about populism. So now I have a new set of talking points, I guess. This is my thought on Dan's presentation. So what's interesting about the U.S. analogy is that, in the subnational authoritarianism literature, the Gibson book is great, and Mickey's book is great as well. But one thing that I've always thought sort of funny about it is that there's this sort of presumption that you have this democratic national system and these authoritarian enclaves, as if they're somehow sealed off and not infecting the national political system. So to say that the definition of a subnational authoritarianism is that the national level is democratic seems to me to be kind of crazy, because, as we were talking about at lunch today, the presence of these subnational units where there was restrictions on the franchise meant the national political system was not democratic. And so not just in the sense that voters had vote rights restricted and so on at the subnational level, but actually very institutionally, the organization of politics in U.S. states. Thinking of VOK, this is what I sort of know this from. The way that the subnational politics affected the national politics was in a very specific institutional way. And so my question is this mirrored in any way in the EU? And in particular, the way that this worked in the U.S. was through a set of norms in the U.S. Senate, which were the kind of norms of seniority. So committee chairmanships went to the most senior people who'd been in the Senate the longest. And if you have a single-party system in the South, these guys were around for a long time. And so many of the Senate committees during this period were chaired by Southerners, Southern Democrats. And in particular, the Judiciary Committee approving Supreme Court justices were Southerners. And it's the Supreme Court that's supposed to be enforcing, equal protection and so on within the states. And so there's this way in which there's this sort of three-step process where you have single-party rule in the state. You have control of the Judiciary Committee, which affects the Supreme Court, which then in turn feeds back and reinforces the kind of authoritarianism in the subnational unit. So makes this kind of equilibrium hard to break. So I'm wondering, in the context of the EU, is there something analogous, and how do you explain exactly why the EPP is so afraid of taking on Orban? Maybe you could elaborate a bit more on what is it exactly that they don't, what are they getting out of this relationship, as somebody, I think you had said before, the Russians and the populists? Why is this so critical? And is there something beyond party politics? I guess the story of the U.S., I'm trying to think of the analogy. And so maybe I'll just offer it up to you. Is there an analogy to what I just described in the U.S., in Europe, and how would that kind of play out? So we could open it up for questions. Okay, and you have to leave in a few minutes. Okay, in 5 minutes. Okay, so we'll get a couple of questions. Yes.
Quick.
Yeah.
It seems to me that support for the Kelemen is simply balancing. Against it, you usually, you ally with the most powerful opponent of the EU, which is surprising to me. And Cass, Dan Slater calls many of these guys demagogues, not populists. And to a certain extent, I wonder if, thinking between populists or quote-unquote populists that actually have real policy behind their outsiderness versus those that are purely rhetorical in their sort of claim to represent outsiders. You can define things any way you want, but somehow putting Trump there with Chavez, Chavez, who actually had, something, policy behind them in the same category, it's a little uncomfortable. And finally, Dan's presentation, Dan, I feel like, you have a very pessimistic take, but I do wonder, Hungary has been a fairly soft authoritarian. And so, these dark scenarios, one optimistic idea is that, now, the CEU, I guess is a test case, they really go out there and Merkel is like, EPP, schmeepp, man, there are limits, right? And so I guess I want to press you on that.
Yeah.
One thing that occurred to me recently in a seminar panel that we're not making enough of the distinction between populist and popular. If we pay attention to the distinction, we can maybe get away from some definition of the issue. But for Cass, the question is to push a little bit more. Think about Venn diagrams. One is authoritarian, one is populist. What is the relationship? It is just the intersection, or populists are completely within authoritarian, just a subset, or the other way around. And another question is, do we know enough about what really drives the youth? Well, this is very important with Grid. I am in the project that, we have interview material, and you can hear statements like, this is not about my material situation, which is not that bad. I just do not see any sense about me. I need some sense in my life. It seems not the material concern, but some kind of moral disorientation or something. Do we have any data to sort it out? And finally, to both of you actually, because you started talking about the relationship with the center-right and the right.
Yeah, right.
And there are moments where center-rights come to dominance. It comes and goes, it fluctuates, right? Do we know anything about why this flips from center-right to extreme right and back?
Let's get one more question and then allow Alina in particular to answer. Yes. So why don't we start with you?
Well, just to answer that question, and I think what you also brought up, Lukan, look, I just said this off the cuff a bit, but I actually do think it's pretty surprising because, and this will go back to your question as well, they don't need to be pro-Russian to win votes. And in fact, they're taking a political risk when they do it, because if you look at data, it's actually pretty inconsistent depending on the survey, but voters of the far right are not overwhelmingly pro-Russian at all. There's one Pew survey that showed that voters, I think it looked at 5 European countries, and they looked at your average voter versus a far right voter and what they thought their level of confidence of Putin. And it was like maybe 10 percentage points difference. So the far right voters were more pro-Putin, But still, I mean, the highest number was 30%, and that was in France. And so that means 70% are not. So why take the political risk is the question to me. I think there's a few answers to that. One, yes, it is this kind of image making. So when Le Pen goes to the Kremlin and meets with Putin, that makes her look very presidential, right? There's this kind of stylizing to it. I think on the other hand, yes, it's a convenient shorthand for, I guess, not really articulating this illiberal model, right? Where Putinism has come to symbolize that model in a, I guess, some ideological space. And so that's helpful. And, you know, I do think maybe there's a quid pro quo there at some level. I mean, we don't really know about that part of it. But certainly, you know, Le Pen has gotten some money out of the Kremlin. Maybe some other parties have as well. We don't know. So I think all of those things come together. And again, like in any social movement, you have true believers. So there may be some people who are part of the National Front or Jobbik or some other party who really think Putinism is a viable model of governance. Then you have some people who are opportunists, and they think this is a convenient, you know, shorthand for summarizing a sort of authoritarian worldview that is anti-EU, that's anti-establishment. And then there's the free riders. I mean, this is the composition, I think, of any social movement. So I think there's multiple layers there, but I do think it's not so intuitive from my view. Like, why take the political risk? You know, maybe because the foreign policies don't win elections. It's always, people tend to vote for anybody, far right, center, whoever, because of domestic issues, not because of foreign policy issues. So maybe it's just a cost-benefit analysis, you know, but these are questions that I have that I don't think we have good answers to. And I think you're right that image piece does have something to do with it. And I think a pro-Putin foreign policy is actually an anti-establishment foreign policy in many European countries, not all, but some. And so I think that also goes into this broader narrative about these parties seeing themselves or install themselves as being the leaders of the opposition, the anti-establishment opposition. And if I may, just one comment about what you said about populism. You know, I think most of us agree that populism is a tool, right? It's a political tool that can be deployed by anybody, actually. And I think in some ways, some center-left candidates are catching on to this as a way to try to compete with the far right. So, I mean, I've been obsessively studying what's been happening in France. And, you know, Macron, that's what he's trying to do. I don't know how effective he's been. Certainly in the polls, he's doing okay, but who knows? But he's been styling himself as an anti-establishment candidate who is pro-European, right? So it's a repackaging of those same European values, principles, liberalism, etc., but with this populist bent to it. And I think that is an interesting flip, right? Because it shows that you can have a progressive pro-European policy agenda that has this, that captures the populist moment, you could say, or the populist zeitgeist, as I think Kaz is in his presentation.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll turn it over. I mean, one interesting thing I just have noticed also just in recent months really is that economists, I don't know if there's any economists here in the room, but any economists are, you know, suddenly vigorously studying populism. And they're, you know, really interested in all the perils of populism. And I sometimes, and it makes me wonder, you know, is this really what they're studying are the perils of democracy? But by calling it populism, it somehow, you know, so what then makes me think, well, we call anything we don't like, we call populist at some level. And so, you know, there is this interesting conceptual set of problems. But maybe, Kos, if you have thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to convince the vast majority of you anyway of the definition, but like much of whether people believe in what they say, politicians believe in what they say or not, we will never know. And I find it very odd to say about one group of politicians that they don't believe in it and the others they do. And so I take populism serious as long as it's used consistently within the ideology, the propaganda of parties. And so what you see in what I believe are populist parties is that the monism and the moralism inform pretty much their whole view. Whereas you have other parties which actually ideologically have conflict around interest and accept pluralism, and at times use populist rhetoric in campaigns. Sure. Also, some use nationalist rhetoric at times, even some use some type of socialist rhetoric. These things happen. Like, this is the real world. We don't have perfect cases. They're always like hybrids. But I do believe that it is more than just a tool. I also believe that it's not just demagogues. Demagogues, to a certain extent, have no particular agenda and tend to be not particularly consistent. Now, one of the problems is I think many people perceive populism through the lens of Trump. Trump is an outlier in almost every single aspect. And I honestly don't believe Trump is a populist. And he wasn't in his campaign populist until Bannon came along. If you look at the other parties that I tend to study in Europe, they're much more consistent. Do they mean it? I don't know. But I don't think anyone can prove that they don't mean it. And so the point is, it informs what they do, it informs why people vote for them, and it informs their policies when they come to power. Now, the Jan Werner Müller's book, I think, is fantastic. I disagree with both his interpretation of populism and democracy, and yet come virtually to the same conclusions about the relationship between the two, which is interesting. I get his argument. I get his argument that a democracy can only work well if it is a liberal democracy. I don't think that is necessarily completely consistent with particularly empirical study of democracy. And I think it is problematic to see populists purely as authoritarian, because I think it's an essential part of the ideology has to do with democratic legitimacy. And so they need that. It's important that they're perceived as the voice of the people. And that is why they put so much emphasis and energy in manipulating the system, because they have to keep the democratic system. They have to keep elections, because they have to keep that image that they are speaking for the majority. And so what they're doing is they're by and large manipulating the majority, right? So I don't think that it's just out there. Finally, what drives the youth? It's actually a very interesting question. I think it comes back to how you see. In part, that argument of I just need something with sense. I mean, I agree with Alina. I mean, there is no liberal democratic narrative at the moment. It's not just the center-left that has failed. The center-right has failed in recent years. Doesn't have an alternative vision, right? It's mostly Tina politics. There is no alternative, right? And that's not inspiring.
It's mostly what kind of politics?
Tina.
Yeah.
There is no alternative. And that's not inspiring. That's inspiring to a certain extent for people who have things, right? But much of the youth don't. The other thing is you see that the youth is particularly overrepresented among populist parties, the electorate of that, in countries with a closed labor market. And so Austria, although doing well, has a very closed labor market. France, of course, not doing so well, very closed labor market. Greece, similar stories. And so as a consequence, youth really are being excluded from that. In the Netherlands, the PVV doesn't have disproportionately youth among its electorate, because our labor market is actually not so protected.
All right, I'll just touch on a few of these things. Well, I agree with Koss's definition of populism. I find that very convincing. I guess I'm a little more with Jan Werner than you would be, although I think there's a kind of middle ground on, I don't like using the term, and I don't sort of accept the term illiberal democracy. I guess it could exist in theory, but I think in practice, if you're going to be illiberal, then you're not going to stay a democracy. You're going to essentially become an electoral authoritarian regime, because as we said with the tilted playing field, democracy goes back to, I think, your definition, requires free and fair elections, and emphasize the fair part, right? And it's very unlikely, because of the ideology of populism, because it is this idea that there is only one true people and then the enemies, right? So it's inherently anti-pluralistic. But democracy is inherently pluralistic, right? And so I just think that once populists get in power, right, then they're going to basically create very quickly an electoral authoritarian regime because it follows so directly from their ideology. But then just on the other points, so what first thing about a couple things from Dan about the EPP. One thing you said that bugged you about that literature is that the subnational autocrats, don't they sort of inherently poison the national level democracy, so you can't really call it democratic. And I'd say very much so. That's why for me, the democracy crisis in Poland and Hungary, I've been thinking for the past 3-4 years, well, with Hungary first, now with Poland, is by far the biggest crisis the EU faces, bigger than the Eurozone crisis, bigger than the refugee crisis, bigger than Brexit, right? Because it questions the whole raison d'etre of the EU as a union of democracies, right? So yeah, and Orban has European ambitions. He doesn't just want to rule Hungary. He wants to spread and become a leader of the EU and spread his thing. So it's a threat to the whole system, I think. And then also, I think your question was, what's in it for the EPP? Let me be clear. There's very concrete things in it. They want to have a majority because, and this is the irony about the authoritarian equilibrium, by trying to make the European Parliament more powerful to democratize the EU, right? You create all these new incentives, right? So you need to have a majority. Why? Well, for one thing, they tried to democratize the process of selecting the Commission president last year. You guys remember, we're back in the last election, Spitzenkandidat process. Whoever has a majority in the Parliament gets to pick the Commission president. That's the new system. So right? That's all it's saying. You need that majority to get the Commission president. You get control of the Commission, right? And you get control of the legislative agenda and the committees in the European Parliament, etc. And as you said, with your parallels with the U.S., yes, many Fidesz MEPs who've been there a long time are very senior. The vice president positions within the Parliament structure, they get senior positions. Okay, and then I think the last thing, on Lucan's point. I think I tried to make that point. The EU, it's not all a bad picture. And this goes back to that quote from Heravassoni. He says, being within this broad framework of a broadly democratic regime tones down, makes it a soft authoritarianism, right? So, although in the last few days it's gotten a little harder, he arrested some people at protests and things, but generally he's just made people lose their jobs, intimidated, but he doesn't arrest people. He's no Chavez, right? So it's softened it down much more from what it could be in the absence of that EU pressure.
We have a few minutes left. There were a couple. I think I saw Josh's hand early. Okay, keep your hands up just so I can kind of see. Okay, go ahead. Why don't we ask each of the 3 questions and then
Okay. So Dan, I'm just kind of, this is so interesting because I've heard, I've spent years listening to people tell me that the European Parliament was irrelevant, right? And now you're saying that the European Parliament is so important, right, to the right in Germany that they would essentially put the fate of the European project, if you're right that this is the single biggest thing that's facing it. The interesting thing about this is it seems, and this goes back to the thing of whether the CEU is going to have changed things or anything like this, but it does seem like this is relatively easy to squash. You've got 2 out of 27 countries where this is going on, and all it would take was a slight change of will on the part of Merkel. And so I guess my question is, why do you think it's such a bigger problem than Merkel thinks it is? Why wouldn't Merkel, if it's as serious a threat to the European project right now, especially in the time of Brexit when things are being rethought, I guess that's kind of my question. It seems to me like you've presented this pessimistic story, that there are these structural features, but if it's such a threat, it seems like it would be so easy for the other 25 countries to say, you've gone too far, we are a union of democracies here. And so the EPP takes a slight hit, it drops its minority a little bit, it just got its Commission president back again, there are more elections coming up, this kind of thing. So I guess I'd love to hear more about that, maybe not even now, we can talk more about it over dinner. And then to both of you, I want to just ask you a question, because I've been working on the support for far-right parties, and I'm just sort of really curious anyone in this audience, right? The big paradox of the far-right support seems to be, you have an economic collapse, support for the far-right goes up, and yet we cannot find real evidence at the micro level that economic conditions are driving support for the far-right. We find in our papers that prospective pocketbook concerns are heavily correlated with far-right support, not the other 3 measures. And quite frankly, it was exactly that same way before the crisis when we were not doing as well. And it's primarily driven by Eastern Europe as opposed to Western Europe anyway. My best take on this is that what's happened is the crisis maybe made the salience of things that far-right parties were stronger on more serious. is there something else? What's going on here? What's your guys who've been studying this much longer than I have, in the past, I'm particularly interested. What explains this rise right now? Is it simply the Syrian crisis? That seems awfully reductionist to me. So is it, if it's not that more people are being attracted to these parties because of their poor economic conditions, that follows on Diana's thing with Trump and that sort of stuff, what's driving this rise before we close the conference?
Yeah, so before answering that, I'm going to call on David, who maybe can give his opinion on that question as well as give his own question. Yeah, and Javier as well. Yeah. Okay.
No, we can table all
Yeah,
that.
okay.
But picking up on what Josh said for Dan, could one not have an alternative reading of the crisis that looks very much like America looking at her three biggest things she has to do in the next couple of years, solving that crisis, what's going on in Russia, and now we've got refugees. And at some point there is just no room, kind of, to deal with that. Is that a possible explanation? Because I too share some of the skepticism about the European Parliament. I don't really be convinced that it matters. It also seems to me though that it could be, and you say this, I think, in your government competition piece, that it could be really tricky. You don't want to set yourself up for failure if you do this and then boom, not only Poland, but maybe a couple other deviating states that don't like the precedent suddenly, then you look like a disaster, right? Then it's not only have this threat. So are they afraid to use it? And I think they are. I'm afraid that they won't. Think they'll go and get it. And I agree with Cass about, no stuff in general, and then the points about, this golden age. I mean, it was very glorious years of conception. It's looking more and more like that. That was the period in which active politics played a relatively small role. And before and after, it was that should be the baseline expectation. But I don't think we've said enough about the possibility of lessons in the last 20 or 30 years of politics in Europe, predicting silliness, waste of time, incompetent outcomes as well. And that is a big part, an important part of the story. And that's what I would have predicted. That's what a big part of the lessons have been.
Wait, can you say say that again? I don't get what that meant.
Put it like this.
Yeah.
In a way, if you think about the Front National in France, it took 30 years and millions of votes, and it's done how much? I mean, really, at the end of the day. So millions of votes are being wasted here in this fashion. And some of it has to do with the fact that the policy proposals on their face are silly, unconstitutional, or too vague to be acted upon. The populism can be a waste of time, and it can be very, very incompetent to show bear. So one could expect crises. The first couple of years of the upgrade of government will go this into account. Let's not focus on the successful, at least, outcomes as much as we should. And my goodness, can you imagine a bigger policy failure than handing the Democrats Obamacare essentially forever in a situation in which you didn't think it was going to happen? I mean, it's stunning, right? And that happened to some extent for skill, lack of political experience, lack of understanding, and these things really matter. So I think that incompetence and silliness and lack of actually thinking into the rules could be a big part of this, the outcome we should be
Thank you. So Javier is our last one. Yeah.
I'd like to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the gun direction. This to me seems perhaps a turning point. And correct me if I'm wrong, but could it be that following from what David was saying, that populism rises within the neighborhood, it wins in certain countries, but then there's a backlash. Other countries see the problem and
Yeah, all things come in three, so it's Brexit, Trump, and, the French election, or is it the Austrian, the Dutch, and the French election? I mean, what's going to happen? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very happy to directly kill that illusion about the Dutch. I mean, first of all, the Dutch elections were covered by the international media with no understanding about the Dutch elections, and so they saw things that were never there, that weren't covered in the Dutch media. Wilders was peaking at 25% at the time that the VVD peaked as well, which had various reasons why he peaked, but was unsustainable. And so in the end, he underperformed. It was more that the VVD, the Conservative Party, overperformed. It was really the only one who really overperformed. And they overperformed on the basis of some very dubious reasons, most importantly, just adopting nativism, Islamophobia, and authoritarianism to a level that we have not seen in the Netherlands before. And that comes after 10 years of moving to the right. And so I think the Dutch elections were important, and I was ecstatic when I saw the exit polls, but actually purely for that reason. I wanted the narrative to change. The narrative was that populism is defeating status quo, which actually in reality wasn't happening. And now the narrative is changing, and now we're looking at the French election pretty much on who is going to win. If Marine Le Pen wins, we go back to that narrative. If she loses, populism is over, which is insane because populism is still, at least right-wing populism, more successful than it's ever been, right? But the narrative decides the agenda, and given that political science is fun, but politics and being a citizen is much more important, I rather have this new bad narrative of populism is losing. But in the Netherlands, nothing was particularly stopped. The right-wing populists have won exactly the same as their height in 2010, and in the next election they're going to go up. And at the same time, we remain, at least in political discourse, the most Islamophobic country in Europe. I'm going to sneak in 3 points about the Germans. I think the EU Council plays a much bigger role than the Parliament. EPP has lost various positions there and have always dominated. The CSU plays a major role for Merkel. The CSU is a big, big fan of Orban, and German businesses who have pretty much bought up Hungary and are very willing to work with Fidesz. It costs them a lot of money because you need payoffs, but you get a lot for it. The economic crisis has not led to an increase of radical right success. Actually, there were as many parties that won as that lost. The increase that we see is almost completely the refugee crisis. And what you also see is how short-term that effect is. It still leads up, but almost all of the radical right parties peaked in late 2015 and a little bit later in 2016 again. Now they're going down, and some significantly down. AFD is less than half of what they were. PVV in the Netherlands was half in the end of their peak. Now the important thing is they can go back there, right? I mean, depending on what kind of thing there is. And the peak is always contextual, right? It doesn't mean that now forever Geert Wilders has a 25% peak. It might go up, right? Marine Le Pen had a lower one. And so I think it's consistent. I think it's consistent with the fact that we don't find pure economic considerations. Because already in the 1990s, right, populist radical right parties were the most successful in the best performing areas by and large. It was Austria with remarkably low unemployment. It was in Flanders, right, Denmark. And so it is actually consistent with that.
So Dan, we're going to give Dan the very last word if he would like, because he had the first word, so he should also have the
Well,
last
thanks.
word.
That's great. Yeah. So just quickly, yeah, and I agree very much. Just to sort of reiterate a couple of points, Cost, maybe get to your question, Josh. Yeah, and in the paper I talk, it's also the council. It's not just in the European Parliament, but Orban has the advantage that he's not just helps with the majority in the Parliament, but he runs a government, right, which gives them a head of government in the council. And the EPP doesn't even have that many heads of government in the council, right? So that's a big factor too. And you see this. Let me put this another way. some of you are asking, well, weren't there other reasons? Didn't they fear they might fail, right? And there was no room to act because of the multi-pronged crises. There were so many other issues. Yes, I mean, the fact that the EU was dealing with the Eurozone crisis and then with the refugee crisis and with Brexit, those were all reasons, at least, that excuses were given, really, for why they couldn't do more about Orban, because there's too much on the agenda, etc. Also, the fear of failure. Some people said, we tried to act against the Freedom Party in Austria, and that didn't go as planned and didn't really stop them. I'm not going to tell that story. So maybe we just fail again here and it would backfire. That was, of course, strengthened by the fact the main opposition party is neo-Nazi, right? So it's like, do you want a kind of mini Putin or do you want neo-Nazis? We'll take Putin, right? So all that, but all that being said, see, that would explain maybe why they wouldn't act. It wouldn't explain why they actively, people like Manfred Weber from the CSU, actively campaigned for Orban, saying how great he is, championing him. Why at the Malta conference of the European People's Party last week, the president of the party, Joseph Daul, French conservative, said, I would put my hand in the fire for my friend Victor, right? So they don't have to go out of their way to do it, but they do because of this. And yeah, and I mean, I guess the last thing I'd say, oh, it's only 2 out of 27. Can't you squash this problem? Isn't it easier? I mean, you need, for the biggest punishments, the biggest things, other than, let's say, the party political things you could do just among European, but to really impose EU sanctions, you need unanimity, right? So they could have acted against Orban. They didn't have the guts. Now they have 2 autocrats, and that's harder to do, right? Because the Orban and Kaczynski are sworn to protect one another.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for a great conference.